Hey everyone, so we're doing a training session for round two of USUDC. The motion reads, "This House regrets the decline of class as the primary organizing political identity for Indigenous peoples in Latin America." We'll start with a PM-LO exchange on the motion, and then we'll move into discussing our reasoning for placing the motion in round two, broader strategic notes about the motion, as well as additional case lines you can run beyond what you've seen here. Pranav, are you good? Class may be dismissed, but so is opposition in this round. Two arguments. Firstly, why we get more political success on our side of the House. There are two broad components you need to look at in determining political success. The first is, how strong is your movement internally? And the key point in this argument is that class is a unifying factor across different Indigenous identities. And the reason for this is that many indigenous groups experience high levels of economic deprivation. This is due to a variety of factors: conquistadors displacing groups from ancestral lands, or a historical lack of legal recognition, which made economic prosperity relatively more difficult to attain. So, on our side of the house, indigenous groups can be activated along the lines that they are all oppressed by the landed elite, especially historically. What's the problem on their side of the house? When you make your ethnic and cultural identities a more explicit part of your organizing, that divides indigenous groups. There are over 20 different indigenous groups in Ecuador. Bolivia has over 30. Why does that divide them? Because many such groups and peoples are mestizaje. They're from mixed racial backgrounds. And even when they're unambiguously indigenous, many such people don't want to identify that way, and therefore don't ally themselves with specific ethnic and cultural groups. But also, even if you do identify as indigenous, as Op will probably argue, your interests are relatively more niche. That's why Pachakutik, for example, had trouble finding success, because there were divisions between highland and lowland indigenous groups across the country in Ecuador. So this establishes why you get more coordination among different indigenous peoples on our side of the house, whereas Op hampers that coordination. Even if this doesn't translate to political success, it also means that on a local level, such groups are relatively more prosperous. It means more mutual aid that's practiced by different groups in the Andean region that otherwise might be from different backgrounds. It means stronger collective defense against land grabs. See what happened in the Zapatista rebellion. So even if you don't push for full autonomy politically on our side of the house, you don't have your land as forcefully taken from you, and you can still more robustly defend yourself against clear and explicit threats against you. Factor number two in determining how much political support you were able to elicit. And there are two broad groups of people who I want to talk about, or maybe three. Under class-based organizing, indigenous people saw an empirical uptick in support from progressive whites and mestizos. And namely, because such groups operated under broader peasant unions, which also pushed for things like land redistribution, that meant that such people were also willing to reciprocally support indigenous peoples in their goals. That's why MNR in Bolivia during the 50s saw significant success in redistributing land to other indigenous groups, as well as other peasants and poor people that lived within the country. And on top of that, when you ally yourself with leftist movements, leftist parties, other wealthier leftists are also relatively more sympathetic to your cause when you ally with them, for the reason that you are now also fighting on behalf of their leftist causes, their leftist ideology that they want to get implemented in politics. Why does that matter? Your movement gets far more donations, which you can then pool in order to politically mobilize, in order to pay organizers so that they can take time off work, to block roads when you're implementing neoliberal policies which deprive people of their economic rights. But the second broad thing I want to point out is that you're also more likely to get political support from elites. The way that Evo Morales came to power was by appealing to a very wide coalition of workers, indigenous people, and people generally on the left. Why is that? Because when you're part of a larger interest group, political elites have to cater to you to make electoral gains. Your group is, by definition, far larger and therefore more electorally determinative. But when you're part of smaller and more discrete groups, they can leave you behind. So there's relatively less of a political incentive to cater to what your interests ultimately are. I know what Op is going to say. These elites are going to co-opt you. Flip this claim. It is good for elites to moderate the aims of indigenous groups. And the reason for this is very simple. It ensures that such groups don't get too extreme in their ends, because when they get too extreme, these groups become far easier to demonize and for a far longer period of time. See, for example, Ecuadorian indigenous peoples attempting coups, which then subsequently made them relatively more easy to demonize. On our side of the house, when you're more moderate, you're more palatable, even to donors, which also means you're more likely to get international support from charities like the Rainforest Action Network, because they don't see you as being a relatively unstable and risky group to fund. They might say, aha, but if you use class, you're easier to demonize, especially because the rise of neoliberalism during the 80s. Maybe this is true during the neoliberal period, but this motion doesn't apply then. On average, there's a very strong leftist heritage in Latin American politics. See, for example, the pink tides that resurged throughout the 21st century. And even if that's untrue, our arguments apply in the average case, where theirs only apply during a specific period. So there are two endpoints of this argument. One, ops advocacies for policies like territorial autonomy will be unsuccessful because these groups have less political support and are less unified internally. In many cases, you need national recognition of that autonomy. You need explicit provisions in the Constitution in order to get your land recognized and in order to ensure that you get devolved group rights. On our side of the House, more national recognition means one, you get redistribution programs which help a larger number of indigenous groups, not just the lucky few indigenous groups that exist in places like Ecuador, where you have a lot of local political influence. But secondly, when you have a long-term political presence in politics, that's the way to get anything op wants, even if at the end of the debate you think it's good. Why? Because you embed yourself in the political system initially, like Morales did, and then subsequently make changes to the Constitution. So you never get quotas in parliament in the first place on their side of the House. Whereas on our side, when you embed yourself initially through leftist parties, you then can get indigenous recognition by first establishing political respect. But secondly, with more political success, that also means the types of policies we push for are better. See, for example, Morales' efforts to implement price controls. Why are these great? Because they prevent things like inflationary spirals during economically difficult periods, and they make it easier for indigenous groups to access basic goods like food, especially when they already face economic deprivation. But secondly, let's assume that both sides are successful. Are opposition's policies even good? We argue they are probably not. One, maybe extraction happens more commonly on our side of the House, but this is fine because it leads to a significant amount of job creation for many people who are in similarly difficult and destitute economic conditions. So even if on both sides of this debate we're both benefiting people who are in relatively difficult economic positions, at least the number of people who are benefited is far larger on our side of the House, whereas their benefit is only constrained to specific communities. But on top of that, there's good reason to believe that extraction may happen anyway due to the power of corporations. Here's the difference. At least on our side of the House, when you are more embedded in the political system, when you as a leftist party can do things like horse trade and bargain, that means that you get moderation of how that extraction, how those land grabs happen. So for example, think about the implementation of things like prior consultation laws, where you need to consult the indigenous groups first and negotiate with them in order to plan out exactly how you are going to extract resources from the local territory. That never happens on their side of the House because you're far easier to demonize as extreme. You're not embedded in the political system in the first place. But also, notwithstanding any of that, we're just going to take a hard materialist stance. Money is facilitative of other goods in life, like your access to healthcare or your ability to defend your land.
Okay, great. Starting in starting in three, two, one, go. Two arguments, one on making better forms of change, secondly on better political outcomes. Firstly, on better forms of change. The first thing to note here is that a lot of the class-based policies Gov want to talk about will be implemented anyways, precisely because of the power of the left-wing governments that they themselves argue. Already, because the vast majority of people are already quite, demanding of trying to increase their economic development, already have long history of Marxism existing within their own economies in many instances, which means a lot of the generalizable, class-based policies that try and there to help and uplift the poor people across the country is going to happen to a lot of instances. What I think we need instead is far more concentrated efforts within specific regions in order to get the land recognition in the first place, which is the reason why, first of all, I'm not certain this coordination effort from Gov is as essential as they claim to be. The next thing I want to note is on whether we can be unifying anyways. The first thing to say here is I think all indigenous groups will still agree that they ought to receive a lot of the basic rights in the first place. Most of them want their environments to be protected regardless of the cultural ethnic group they come from. Most of them want their own land grabs to be stopped, which means one, they can always have some incentive to come together to create, say, larger pools of funds or specific marketing departments or NGOs to try and get support or funding from outside in order to be distributed among different land grabs whenever they're happening. But I also argue in most of the problems we want to talk about, local support is is essential anyways, precisely because you need to know and understand your own land and your ability to coordinate within it in order to try and get the most amount of change, right? If like 5 or 6 areas are getting land grabbed within your specific country, it doesn't matter if you are well coordinated, because you need to split up the group of people that are fighting for to stop different land grabs, of starting to protect the environment of 5 or 6 areas. So even if it is localized, that doesn't impede us from accessing our benefits anyways. The third thing I want to note, however, though, is a lot of the neoliberalism gov claims is actually existing prior to the 1980s. Unfortunately, a lot of American governments are already indulging in significant amounts of intervention within these economies prior to the 80s anyways. And the reason for this is pretty obvious. A lot of these economies were seen as moving in a more Marxist direction, and a lot of American governments were really frightened that they were going to become actively communist or go with the Soviet Union or USSR, which is why they in many instances either actively toppled a lot of those governments or infiltrated them by setting up companies anyways. The point being, which is that the class-based benefits they want to talk about will happen today, but even if it will happen today, there's always the risk it could be taken away tomorrow, because the IMF and the United Nations prior to the 1980s, because USA prior to the 1980s would intervene and destroy you anyways. Quickly, can we embed into the system? I think the problem with trying to get respect is that it's far easier to be co-opted instead into doing big things. It may be true that perhaps you have a coordination into some significance of a voting bloc, but this doesn't require that you actually be the main one to get the change, because it's not clear you're as large of a voting bloc as, say, other groups of individuals who are not, for example, from your specific community or who are part of the majority. So the attempt to provide you money, if this is true, isn't necessarily going to translate, even if you get money, even if you're one large group, it's never clear you're going to be a large enough group anyways. But secondly, and this is a simple thing, if gov is right and class is a unifying factor, it doesn't mean that cultural identities get erased. If gov's logic is true and people anyways have strong cultural identities, the fact that you are attempting to paper over them with vague, broad statements, such as, we are all facing similar economic issues, seems like it is ignoring of the deep internal plights of the mestichos that government is so worried about. Which means if gov logic is taken to their endpoint, it's never clear they get the coordination just because people say you ought to identify on class, because gov themselves seem to indicate that that having ethnic identities is often a deeply sensitive thing that often causes people to not identify with the indigenous community in the first place. The third thing I want to note then is on a other positive matter. One, I think our change is often able to be far more long-lasting even if it's localized, because often recognizing indigenous rights is a prerequisite for the class-based policy you want to talk about. Tomorrow, your class-based policies could always be taken away when the government becomes more right-wing, or when it changes with international pressure, either when America comes in or when the other sort of foreign companies want to try and put you away. What's most important is to have your own rights enshrined within the Constitution, having indigenous quotas in many instances, or more indigenous politicians who can fight for you. The best way to get that sort of mechanism panel is to try and ensure that that sort of right is enshrined in the Constitution, to try and fight and protest, sometimes in more angry or in ways that get more recognition, such that is the way you can create the sort of structural change you want, right? Crucially, it doesn't work in the reverse, because class-based policies never have to be targeted specifically for the indigenous group. So it's never clear that your class-based policies actually improves the indigenous communities into the future, because it's just seen as something that's generally helpful or harmful towards the people over there. But thirdly, I think we actually get far more finances abroad, right? Because a lot of the support or international support for indigenous identities is very easy, precisely because it is niche issues that aren't super controversial outside your country. But controversial class-based policies often pushes away a lot of capitalist NGOs or a lot of government, American governments in many instances, right? Whereas things like Oxfam or the Catholic Church are quite happy to provide education to these communities. Notice this is a far larger source of money than their local politicians, especially if Latin America is as struggling economically, in the developmental realm as governments seem to claim. So in many instances, we actually are much better there. The second argument is on political outcomes. I think opposition to neoliberalism is actually quite bad for everybody outside of people within these communities. And that's because often governments had strong incentives in the short term to be exceptionally populist and unaccountable, to provide huge welfare packages in large amounts in many instances, right? And the reason for that is because obviously in order to secure their own benefits, it's far easier to provide insignificant mismanagement that provides money to the people today, even if tomorrow it may harm you, because you may not be the person person in power 10 years or 15 years from now. So that means that they can often actively mismanage the economy really badly, lead to massive amounts of inflation in many instances, or often create huge amounts of recession because in the future your money runs out and the debt is always going to come due. On our side, we get far better moderation because the movements did not try and fight for left-wing class-based policies anyways. Where sure, a lot of economic policies that are class-based may happen anyways because the governments are left-wing, but there is far more moderation with the neoliberalism of American governments later, along with a movement that focuses a lot more on indigenous rights. But secondly, the environment gets harmed a lot. Look, maybe extraction may be used to get jobs anyways, but I think this is often far, far worse anyways, right? Because your land gets destroyed to a far, far greater extent. On our side of the house, at least in some limited instances, you can avoid logging, you can avoid commercialized farming in many ways. And this is important because many indigenous groups never saw the spoil of their rewards anyways, right? So, and that means that class-based organizations may give them growth, may give them a job, but may not give them sufficient money. Whereas on our side, it ensures that the environment that they care about so much is protected. Oppose.
Okay, hi everyone. We're moving into the training portion of this session. So I'll start with talking about our reasoning for placing this motion in round two. And there were two broad considerations that we had. The first was that although, of course, the context of Indigenous peoples in Latin America is very important to the motion, many of you have probably seen a broader debate about identity versus class-based organizing, and a lot of those fundamentals are still being tested in this motion. So we thought this would be better as an earlier warm-up for people to see this earlier before moving into more novel or complex motions that come later in the tournament. Secondly, we had very minor concerns about the CG, but only in extremely sorted rooms where opening government was very thorough in proving their arguments. So to be cautious, we put this motion a bit earlier to ensure that no teams were in such position if they drew CG and therefore weren't disadvantaged. In terms of strategic notes on the motion, I would say in order to do well on the motion, you need to be very specific about the context of Indigenous groups in Latin America. You might want to look at places where Indigenous groups have more influence, like in Ecuador, or less influence, like in Argentina, and you can weigh which set of cases matters more depending on your side. You also might want to look at specific characterizations that you can run, like, for example, the coming commodities boom in Latin America and how that might further affect the way Indigenous groups are treated, the neoliberal turn in the 80s and the relative need for either set of policies. Um, but on the other end of that, at the end of the debate, this motion is also testing your fundamentals of can you debate a social justice motion that you've probably seen some version of before? Can you argue about whether or not political elites will be receptive to your messaging, whether internal division happens more or less, whether the policies you push for are actually good or bad? Pranav, did you have anything to add to that?
No, not really. I think you covered
Cool.
it all.
Okay, so closing government ideas after the PM. I would say there are three broad possible extensions, maybe four. The first is one thing that I didn't touch on as much was some of the more specific policies that OP might advocate for, like territorial autonomy, group rights, devolution. So one closing government could just do the following. OO may be right that they get more success with the policies they push for, but this is just bad. Devolution, for example, means that you are further pushed into economic deprivation. And the reason this is helpful is because it often functions as built-in depth on social justice motions like these, where top half often goes very hard on a success clash. So one strategic thing that you can do from back half is say, to be extremely charitable to the other side. Maybe they are more successful. Here's why, even if they are successful, that's a harm, which also makes it very difficult for the other side to respond to you because you're conceding a large bulk of their analysis on success. Um, the second thing that you can talk about is a bit more characterization. So one thing I didn't touch on was specific time periods that might matter most. One reasonable claim from closing government could be, the future is actually the most important issue in this debate. The commodities boom is going to mean that extraction is going to rise to a more significant extent, which is the real need for Indigenous peoples to turn to class-based organizing. And remember, even though the motion says regrets and includes the past, it also still includes the future. A common misconception is that it doesn't. And then you can weigh this as being more important than the opening government material because it applies over a longer timeline, whereas the opening government material may only be constrained to the past, especially given the examples that I used. Finally, there's probably a lot more material on why specific economic policies that might be more likely to be implemented are actively bad. So I talked briefly about why price controls might be good, but there's probably also other material about why other austerity measures are actively bad for people across the country and why class-based organizing and allying yourself with leftist groups ensures that Indigenous groups aren't subject to such policies to the same extent. And then finally, I was very blippy about it at the end of my speech. So I also think there would be a reasonable extension, which just weighed why materialism is true and why fighting for class-based issues is more important than fighting for identity-based issues. So you can further develop the idea that money is facilitative of other rights, since I wasn't super rigorous about it.
Yep,
Back to you.
thanks. Yeah. So for closing the opposition, I think a couple of similar-ish things, I guess, for Xio. So first is, I definitely do think I am fairly underbaked when talking about some of the issues themselves and why they might be good or worth supporting or why they're bad and not supporting. So for example, I think there can be a lot more explanation on the environmental rights and why, for example, the logging and the extraction to get jobs is not symmetric, which I did not prove. And then I think spending a lot more time weighing this as more important than money is obviously, I think, very essential. So you can attempt to either start this by sort of suggesting about how, I don't know, like the money that you're talking about is often not going to reach you. You can spend a lot more time developing why that money doesn't reach you in many significant ways, or you could just attempt to say why to the average Indigenous person at that point in time, like environmental concerns were exceptionally important, and thereby why like not catering very explicitly to that could lead to either internal fracturing. You could also attempt to just generally argue why, because I think Op also has ground to say like what kinds of identity or cultural policies are good, right? So like I don't know, like bilingual programs or like human or like foreign exchanges, for example, maybe different like communities within the country, stuff like that is can you can often argue is really essential towards like helping them getting a much greater sense of self and belief in their own culture, and in some instances even like reducing some of the inherent fissures with like ethnic identities that they previously may have been having. And then trying to weigh that in some ways over materialism, like in a more charitable way as well. So you can attempt to even like concede that they perhaps get like maybe not like a very significant amount of money, but a semi-significant amount of money, but that just doesn't matter or mean very much if they continue to remain so divided, or if they continue to have like serious mental health harms. The second big, I guess, sort of like area is I think you can be a lot more like, I guess, way about the neoliberalism clash. And I think this is similar to what Matt said about like figuring out what sort of context you want to talk about, when exactly is that neoliberalism rising, and when exactly it hasn't yet risen, and governments are primarily left wing. And then sort of attempting to be a lot more like deliberate or detailed about what specific mechanisms that if when they are class-based they advocate for, how precisely that would lead to say like indulging in like excessive spending and that sort of stuff, instead of what I think I gave was like a very general vague critique of how like like being like too populist is bad. So something like how your movement being class-based is what actually makes it bad is I think a much more like thorough explanation of it. The third and final area is while I do think I spend a lot of time on change, I don't think I do too much to either like weigh one kind of metric on change versus another. So like I argue many things, right? So I may say like class-based distinctions, class-based policies may happen anyways, or our change might be somewhat more long-lasting, or we get more finances internationally. But I think what there is room to do is either a like pick one specific metric and why it's the most important in this period of time. And I think too, and maybe more important, you can I think be a lot more charitable than like I was when trying to advocate why like you're able to get like a specific kind of like why the kind of change you get is more important than the kind of change they get. So sorry, let me rephrase. What I basically mean is I think you have to first wash a little bit of how important the policies themselves are. So I'm very good at proving, not very good, but like I'm like fine at proving that maybe I might get a bit more change on the policies I want to talk about. And if you really want to win, say, on change as the metric, you would, I think, want to first attempt to wash why like the attempt to get more money or they attempt to fight for better environmental rights or land grabs, are either like goals that are somewhat equally useful or reasonable, or to some extent why both those goals may happen in the long term anyways. And perhaps what's more important is the interim process, i.e., what is a process by which you either choose to collectivize and come together to fight for issues that aren't maybe like, I don't know, explicitly class-based or aren't explicitly environmental justice or territorial autonomy, or you can just argue how, like, the biggest issue that these communities are facing right now is some level of like internal division, as well as some level of feeling they're not recognized, and sometimes making them feel deeply recognized as a member of their community is an essential first step towards thinking that other identities aren't subsuming my own. So like the way I would sort of run this is like sometimes it's very easy to give like sort of vague or pithy platitudes, and what's often first needed is like greater or deeper acknowledgement of what my ethnic or cultural identity is before I am willing to then also reciprocate, i.e., also willing to believe that other people are worth or valuable. Basically, it's like the idea I would run it is like only if they sort of give me some recognition of who I am I willing to sort of reciprocate and give it to another indigenous community who is having a different sort of culture or ethnic background as I am, and then argue that that leads to, in the long term, far greater unification as opposed to sort of ignoring or suppressing it, and why that's essential. So there are like lines to still run within getting more or less division within change, and I think there definitely is a lot more lines to run on like why these policies are worth fighting for a lot more.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and see you in the next session.